Bias in the news is apparent in the commercial media and in many PBS programs, including Newsroom. Bias implies a one-sided or weighted aspect with reference to some standard of value. It can be deliberate or unintentional, and in many cases, including Newsroom, I presume it to be the latter. The standard of value in vogue with the liberals of today can be traced back to Rousseau. However, to blame him for our present state of affairs would be an injustice. Since his time, we have experienced a knowledge explosion. A true history of our time would indict the intellectual community for their failure to synthesize this mass of knowledge and thus recognize the fallaciousness of the rhetoric which has placed millions in slavery, sentenced untold numbers to torture and death, and now threatens world peace through unilateral disarmament, and has pushed the world to the brink of economic collapse. The revolution has spread like cancer at an exponential rate. It threatens to subvert a generation. It has permeated our school system to the extent that few universities have not felt its impact, and it is now reaching into the lower levels of the educational system. This insidious perversion of our standard of values has resulted in the domination of the news media by those who espouse this humanitarian philosophy. Mr. Robert Novak labeled this trend euphemistically as advocacy journalism. While it is possible to cite reams of examples of bias, a kind and objective treatment is available in Edith Ephron's book, The News Twisters. How is the production of Newsroom program affected by this shift in the standard of values? Well, one means is in the selection of guests. Just as important, however, is the opinion expressed by comments and questions of the staff, which reflect on the background materials utilized. For example, frequent reference is made to the New York Times, which is akin to using the Daily Worker. Many of the major book publishing firms are controlled by the liberal establishment. Thus, many conservative books are either rejected by the major publishing houses or are disparaged or ignored by the reviewers. Consider the book, Stillwell and the American Experience in China by Barbara Tuchman, which justifies the blatant efforts of the State Department representatives to assist Mao to power. It is available in most bookstores and libraries. Compare it with How the Far East Was Lost by Anthony Kubek, which more than refutes the Tuchman propaganda. This book is not found in bookstores, and despite a personal request, was not put on the shelves of the SMU library. Newsroom probably honestly believes that it presents a balanced program. But when Mr. Porterfield classifies his position as the center of the political spectrum, he is talking about a standard of value far to the left of mine. Newsroom's intentions may be good, but a balanced program will only result from a balanced staff.
Americans, by and large, are political romanticists. With childlike faith, we insist upon endowing our high elected officials with virtues fashioned out of nothing more substantial than wistful hopes and campaign literature. Somewhere, we feel, along the road to the White House, there exists a magical political dipping vat through which candidates must swim to emerge on the other side upright, honest and pure, and hopefully changed. To find that this is all just a dream comes as a cruel disenchantment. Out of the rubble of Watergate, out of the tragic disgrace of Agnew, comes the sickening realization that we have been betrayed. And suddenly we find ourselves struggling to accept the awful reality that not even the highest office of the land offers its occupants immunity from the same political immorality we're more accustomed to find at less exalted levels of government. Now, it doesn't make things easier to accept when you suddenly realize that you're not entirely free of guilt yourself, because you helped vote the rascals into office with one swift and uninformed pull of the lever in the polling booth. Then, too, as though to rub salt into our raw and bleeding trust, we keep hearing echoes of ringing phrases we clung to so eagerly. Quotes, "There will be full and complete disclosure." Quotes, "I shall never resign." Quotes, "The high purposes and dedication of Haldeman and Ehrlichman." and the dismal litany goes on and on. What, we ask, can there possibly be in the office of the presidency that makes its acquisition worth using literature alleging homosexual misconduct? But after you have blushed with shame at your gullibility for a reasonable length of time, consider this. You might have lived in a country where such things would never have been brought to light. And the most thrilling realization of all is that the miracle of a democracy lies in its capacity to reveal these dark things that go on within it. And that those wise men who drafted our Constitution, aware of the corrupting influence of power, built into it a wondrous cathartic mechanism that inner pressures seem to trigger automatically. And now has reached up into the second highest office and flushed from it one who thought it could never get that high. So weep no more, voter. As they say in TV commercials, it really works. But remember to keep the sackcloth and ashes handy. You may need them again.
For the last 10 months, our senses have been assailed with a growing number of events that have shocked and dismayed us. Whether our party was Democratic or Republican soon began to mean very little. We saw what looked like the strongest president in our history reduced man by man to what now may be the weakest. Last week, the Vice President of these United States stood up in court and pleaded no contest to one count of income tax evasion in 1967 after having resigned his office of Vice President. I found myself saying silently, "No more, no more." But I was saying that when Watergate was still on commercial television. I didn't mean it then, and I don't mean it now. If there is more, it must come out. The man Agnew means very little and will be easily replaced. What is important is what happens to the office he held. Vice President of the United States is the second highest office in our land, and the man who occupies it must be capable of being the president in the event of the death of President Nixon. I think we must continue to pursue Watergate to its tragic end. This must be done in order that we may be able to find out ways and means to prevent the recurrence of this sort of thing. On Bill Moyer's show sometime last year, before Watergate had been fully exposed, he was talking to historian Barbara Tuchman, and she was asked how history would treat President Nixon, and she replied that he would be one of the most tragic presidents. We do not have to wait for history. It is readily apparent that he is a tragic figure, and last Wednesday's event adds to that tragedy. I pray that we as American citizens will take the lessons set forth by these events and put them to use to prevent a future Watergate and compromised vice president. We should also take steps to assure again that the sons or daughters of the poorest could aspire to reach the presidency and remove it from the province of the rich. Perhaps that is a lot to expect out of the sordid mess of Watergate and Baltimore, but it is a sincere hope, and I think we, the American people, can and must have it. Soon the no more, no more I have cried for will come, and we must be ready to act on what we have learned.
The Agnew situation is indeed a symptom of a dangerous and deplorable trend in this country, but this trend has nothing to do with the guilt or the innocence of the former vice president. Indeed, it has little to do with the state of politics at all. What it does have to do with is abuse of authority. I can't say that Mr. Agnew is innocent of the charges brought against him, nor can anyone with certainty say that he's guilty. All that anyone can truthfully say is that it can never be proved one way or the other. The flagrant, injudicious, and possibly vicious abuse of authority to which I refer is the tormenting twins of press leaks and immunity from prosecution. When a defense attorney finds himself representing a man who's clearly guilty of lying, stealing, extorting, and whatever, it doesn't take much imagination to invent nor finesse to accomplish the type of situation that confronted Mr. Agnew. The scenario reads something like this. Mr. Prosecutor, my client, Ralph Ripoff, in exchange for immunity from prosecution, will be happy to testify that every second Thursday of the month, Pope John III rode by his office on an albino yak, which he parked in a fire zone, and picked up 2 million drachma in small unmarked bills. This was his cut of the confessional concession at the Third Church of Latter-day Druids. Incidentally, Mr. Prosecutor, I'll also see to it that this is leaked to my brother-in-law, the city editor of the Daily Clarion, Bugle Banner, Sun Herald Times Gazette. Now, faced with this type of surefire insurance against losing a face-saving trophy, what battered, beleaguered, but still ambitious prosecutor could resist? Of course, I have no doubts that he sincerely thinks that he's doing the right thing. After all, the first thing he learned in law school is that the end always justifies the means, if your heart is pure and the stakes are high enough. The simple fact is that there's no way that Mr. Agnew could have gotten a fair trial. Even without a long line of Ralph Ripoffs ready to spill their real and imaginary guts to the grand jury, anything less than a public lynching would have provoked loud and anguished cries of whitewash and cover-up from the liberal and Democratic ranks, especially from the new superstars of that all-time favorite TV soaper, Mr. Pius Goes to Washington, otherwise known as the Sam Irwin Show, which incidentally is unique in that it consists of equal parts relentless interrogation, righteous indignation, and rustic hypocrisy. Pardon me if my cynicism is showing, but I would be very surprised if any politician in the biz over one fiscal quarter has not been amazed to find himself on the happy end of one or another of some kind of income-producing opportunity. As difficult as it might be for our clear-eyed, fresh-faced young lawmaker to accept such a favor, in spite of the no-strings labels pasted prominently thereon, after enough of these are offered, it becomes even more difficult to refuse. Sailing close to the wind is a skill much practiced and oftentimes highly developed by even the most dedicated idealist. To be perfectly candid, I'm not nearly as afraid of the man who might be tempted to feather his own nest as I am of that noble dude that wants to fill every empty pocket in the country for the sake of securing a slot on next century's history exam. He would buy economic equality at the price of national incentive. For him, the mean is the end. The petty practice of personal improvement was no doubt present when politics was pioneered at the first caucus of the Caveman Council. The more flagrant cases will inevitably self-destruct in the light of day. It's the dark art of immunity from prosecution, press leaks, and plea bargaining that destroys the vital concept of a fair trial before an impartial jury. This maneuver is no more than legal blackmail, and the ransom note reads, "Leave your reputation beside the poisoned well." This is the abuse of authority to which I refer. This is the evil that lurks in the shadows and will forever cast it out on the guilt or the innocence of Spiro Agnew.